Horror. This is actually one of my favorite genres, so I just want to introduce you guys a little bit to what makes the horror genre, and then we're going to use this to lead into us talking about voice and mood in writing. Tomorrow, you guys are going to get to read Edgar Allan Poe's The Master of Horror, his story called The Telltale Heart. So let's talk really fast. What is the horror genre? So I want you guys to think for just a second about any scary movies or scary books that you might have seen or read, or video games, which can be really scary sometimes because you're like in them, living them. And I want you to think, what's something that they all have in common? So what is something that they all have in common? All those scary things. I want to show you something really fast. We're going to be talking about the horror genre. A genre is basically just a type or category of books, movies, and TV shows or video games that try to be scary or shocking. So again, genre is like a type or category. Oh no, we don't want him to talk for us. So within this genre, like other types of, other types of genres that you guys might see are like horror, sci-fi, mystery, romance. Nonfiction is a genre. Okay, so we're going to go down. Setting a purpose. As you read, pay attention to the points the author makes about horror stories. Do her ideas make you think about horror stories in new ways? So if you guys will just follow along with me. Many people define horror by its subjects. We all think of creatures like Frankenstein's monster, Dracula, and the Wolfman as monsters in the horror genre. Each one of these creatures has a history and developed over a period of time. But we also know that horror covers more than just these monsters. We could all make long lists of the kind of creatures we identify with horror, especially when we start thinking of films as well as literature. The minute we would start to make such a list, we would also realize that not all monsters are alike, and that not all horror deals with monsters. The subject approach is not the clearest way to define this genre. So basically, just because a story is about a monster, you can't call it the horror genre. So what's another way we could define the horror genre? Some students of this genre find the best way to examine it is to deal with the way horror fiction is organized or structured. Examining the organization of a horror story shows that it shares certain traits with other types of fiction. Horror stories share the use of suspense as a tactic with many other kinds of literature. The tension we feel when a character goes into the attic, down into the basement, or just into the abandoned house is partially a result of suspense. We don't know what is going to happen, but that suspense is intensified or like heightened by our knowledge of the genre. Basically saying, because we know we're watching a scary movie, we're like waiting for the loud sound to happen or for something to jump out and scare us. So because we know it's the horror genre, we know something scary is going to happen. We know that the characters involved in the world of horror always meet something awful when they go where they shouldn't. Part of the tension is created because they are doing something we know is going to get them into trouble. Stephen King refers directly to our anticipation of horror. In Salem's Lot, which is one of his books, Susan approaches the house, which is the source of evil. She found herself thinking of those drive-in horror movies epics, where the heroine goes venturing up into the narrow attic stairs or down into some dark, cobwebby cellar. And she thinking, I'd never do that. Of course, Susan's fears are justified. She does end up dead in the basement, a victim of the vampire. So basically, when you watch movies, you're like, why are you splitting up? Or why would you go down into the basement where the sound is coming from? Why don't you just get out of there or call the cops? So it's sort of that expectation of the horror genre. If the horror genre uses the character's search for information to create suspense, to find out what the sound was, it controls when and where we get our knowledge. Because we are outside of the situation, we usually know more than the characters. Our advanced knowledge creates suspense because we, as the readers or as the watchers, can anticipate what is going to happen. The author can play with those expectations by either confirming them or surprising us with a different outcome. When suspense is an important element in fiction, we may often find that the plot is the most critical part of the story. We care more about what happens next than who the characters are or how the story is set. but setting is often considered a part of the horror genre. If the genre has traditional monsters, it also has traditional settings. Only authors who want to challenge the tradition place events in bright, beautiful parks. We expect a connection between the setting and the events in this genre. We are not surprised to find old houses, abandoned castles, damp cellars, or dark forests as important elements in the horror story. So this paragraph is basically just saying we care a lot more about the setting and the mood that's set up than we care about the actual individual characters usually in this genre. It's kind of different. Some people make further distinctions for the genre based on how the stories are organized. We can divide the stories into different categories based on how we come to believe in the events related and how they are explained to us. Stories that deal with parallel worlds expect us to accept those worlds without question. For example, we just believe Dorothy is in Oz. We accept Oz as a parallel world separate from ours. Other times, events seem to be supernatural, but turn out to have natural explanations. The ghosts turn out to be just squirrels in the attic, or scary things that move mysteriously are part of a plot to drive someone crazy. Sometimes the supernatural is the result of the way the central character sees the world, as in stories told from the point of view from a crazy person. Basically, they don't see the world as it actually is, so it can be really creepy or scary. But at times, we're not sure and hesitate about believing in the possibility of the supernatural. When I first read Dracula, I seriously considered hanging garlic on my windows because I believed that vampires could exist. This type of hesitation, when we almost believe, falls into the general category of the fantastic, or as we call it in French, the fantastique. Often horror has its greatest effect on us because we almost believe, or believe while we are reading the book or watching the film, that the events are possible. Yet another way of categorizing works of horror is by the source of horror. Some horror comes from inside the characters. Something goes wrong inside, and a person turns into a monster. Dr. Frankenstein's need for knowledge turns him into the kind of person who literally creates a monster. Dr. Jekyll also values his desire for information above all else and creates Mr. Hyde, which is like his alter ego who's really scary. In another kind of horror story, the threat to the central character comes from outside. An outside force may invade the character and then force the evil out again. The vampire attacks the victim, but then the victim becomes a vampire and attacks others. Some stories of ghosts or demonic possession also fall into this category. We can also look at this is our last paragraph. We can also look at the kinds of themes common to horror. Many works concentrate on the conflict between good and evil. Works about the fantastic may deal with the search for forbidden knowledge that appears in much horror literature. Such quests or adventures are used as a way of examining our attitude toward knowledge. While society may believe that new knowledge is always good, the horror genre may question that assumption, examining how such advances affect the individual and the society. So is an advance in technology always a good thing, or does it sometimes maybe go too far? All right, guys, that's our intro to horror. I'll leave you guys with that one, and we'll be reading The Telltale Heart in our next video. Enjoy.